to Dr. Jan Urk, who is going to address a fascinating topic for us this afternoon, Africa's traditional kingdoms and what role they play today in governance on our continent. The event, this talk is based on a study of the status of traditional kingdoms in Africa under modern constitutions and their role in holding the center to account. The examples that Dr. Urk is going to use are the Ashanti in Ghana, the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda, and the Lozi Kingdom of Barotseland in Zambia. Closer to home, of course, we have the Zulu Kingdom, but I'm not quite sure to what extent we'll be able to address that. Dr. Urk, who's a regular at SIRE, we've had him talk to us in 2018, 2019, earlier this year, in a most interesting lecture on Ethiopia. And now again, we're focusing on Africa as much as we can this year. He is currently the visiting professor at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. He holds a PhD in political science from McGill University in Canada, and he's held teaching positions in various universities around the world. He's the author of a number of scholarly articles and books. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Urk to address the topic of today. Thank you so much. I think he will probably talk for something like 30 minutes, and then we'll be interested in the various questions and answers that will come up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very kind of you. And once again, thanks for the invite to join SIRE. And the topic of today I want to talk about, the traditional kingdoms of Africa, particularly these three relatively well-known ones, is of course taking place at a time when the entire world seems to be changing in a direction that we're not yet sure of. Afghanistan and the Western withdrawal, things that are happening in Syria, in Iraq, the recent riots in South Africa. There seems to be a general sense of disillusionment, a general sense of uncertainty, and dare I say fear about where things are headed, and the nature of liberal democratic order and a system of law and order to provide stability as well as justice to both individuals and communities across the world. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is, at its core, has a somewhat counterintuitive argument. That is, the best defense of modernity, of modern aspirations about individual rights, about individual freedoms and liberties, is tradition. That is the main argument that I want to make today. And the main reason for this is that in our quest to seek the most perfect, the most egalitarian, the most updated best practice from the Western world and copy-paste these into parts of the global South or the developing world that took place in the 1990s seems to have reached an end where the results have not satisfied anyone. The heightened high hopes have been dashed. The young generation hopeless. The fears about the changing world dynamics and geopolitics might take countries in unprecedented direction. So, a moment of the known challenges and perhaps the unknown challenges that are in stock for not only Africa, but the rest of the world. There are now questions about how to best design or reflect on forming political systems. We seek the perfect ideal in the abstract and put all our legal, political, and economic, social and cultural, social and political resources to this end? Or is longevity, stability, gradual, piecemeal, evolutionary change with organic deep roots connecting the land and the people to their political system might be a more viable path ahead? And in this context, it seems interesting that despite being voices of tradition, the three kingdoms in the three countries that I am writing on at the moment, the Asante of Ghana, the Buganda of Uganda, and Lotsi of Zambia, have also done an important service to modern politics in a sense that perhaps 20, 30 years ago we were not completely prepared for. And that is the risk of a majoritarian, a plebiscitarian, a 50% plus one electoral majority that will rule the 50% minus one, and with all the powers that the political system has allowed it. I wonder if my voice is coming okay, because I saw Sheila raise an eyebrow there. Is everything okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, you just froze for a minute, but you're fine now.
Oh, okay, perfect. So what therefore has to be done is to try to reflect on whether or not we can find deep roots of indigenous forms of law governance and find ways to give them modern sort of shine and applicability in a way that would create a sense of ownership, a public ownership over these various constitutional reforms and new documents. No matter how idealistic the intentions, no matter how perfect the design, if constitutions are not embraced by the people, if they are not embraced by localities, if they don't give the sense of an organic sense of belonging to the land and the people, they will simply fail to survive the moment external aid is shut off. So therefore, what we want to do is reflect on ways to see, are there any paths available, any lessons, any insights that could be learned from Africa's experience with relatively successful and functioning traditional kingdoms, as to give us some insight to political stability and justice in the coming decades. So the continent's indigenous traditional systems are all very different. In this particular book manuscript, I'm looking at three sedentary kingdoms. So the Ghana example, the Ashanti, the Buganda from Uganda, and the Lotsi are all sedentary kingdoms with very strong hierarchies that divide power in two ways. They have historically divided power internally at the court between aristocratic, selected, and commoner representatives of various ruling classes of their kingdoms, as well as regionally giving voice to regions that are governed by their own leaders, regions that are governed by appointed, by royal appointees, and regions that have established their sense of loyalty or suzerainty towards the tributary smaller state is in the third way. So in all three cases, what happened was that the British colonial practice of indirect rule ended up providing a historical service to the longevity and the sustainability of these traditional institutions. Now, we also have to be careful when we discuss this notion of indirect rule, because especially in the 1930s and 40s, it was presented in contrast to the Portuguese and the Belgian and the French variants of colonialism in Africa as a more idealistic, more principled one that recognized local authorities. Of course, the reality is a little more nuanced and a little more pragmatic than that. Indirect rule was simply a mechanism to allow the British Empire to govern far away, peripheral, distant regions by outsourcing the day-to-day governance to local leaders. These sometimes were legitimate kings or paramount chiefs enjoying the support of the various institutions and structures of their constitutional order as well as their peoples. But sometimes these were appointed by the more docile members of the ruling classes who were more ready to serve the British. Sometimes there were rivalries between competitors, and they tried to play superpowers or European powers against each other. Sometimes when these entities did not exist, or did not exist in a hierarchical form, they were artificially created by British, and these positions were artificially created in order to establish a sort of a pragmatic day-to-day form of governing distant territories. But regardless of the nature behind the system, what happened was, excuse me, what happened was that they did, in principle, even if the reality had changed from the pre-colonial past, create entities where indigenous law and governance acquired official legitimacy. Now, during this process, there have been a number of losers. Tribal confederacies without strong centers that often were based on pastoralists or nomadic peoples who crossed lands in sort of in the practice of transhumance, herding communities without a strong established center did not serve the colonial practice of indirect rule. So these were often broken up or put under the authority of established territorial people. So the confederacies lost any sense of regional autonomy, any sense of indigenous division of power, any sense of checks and balances indigenous to a political system. In other words, anything that would weaken the ruler's hold were also losers to the historical dynamics. In the meantime, minorities lost, dissenters lost, women lost, regional authorities lost, because what we had was the imposition of a strong, centralized, consolidated sense of traditional authority after colonialism. Now, we could also reflect on this at a logical level, when at the same time in Europe, kings and princes were fighting each other to establish territorial autonomy. They needed to collect taxes. To collect taxes, they needed tax inspectors. To train tax inspectors, they needed schools. To have official schools, state schools, they had to fund it. They had to be standardized language. There had to be an army, a way to collect tax to pay for that army, its training, barracks, uniform. In other words, there was the established ability to extract economic resources from a particular territory through the aid of industrialization and modernization. That allowed these consolidated borders, state authorities to establish the nation state, the unitary nation state. Whereas when we think about the African continent, without established borders, without zones, without industrial production, without a standing army, without state bureaucrats, all rulers, by definition, had to govern in a way that balanced off regional and court interests against each other. Rulers had to first establish the fact that they were acting in the legitimate voice of their people, based on their indigenous constitutions, the religions, and also to convince of the people. In other words, it was a pre-modern form of representative politics, precisely because the kings, the paramount chiefs, lacked the economic, political, and military power to impose their rule over generations. Of course, there have been cases of militarily successful kings that have invaded neighboring land, but this has been the exception. The majority has been a sense of indigenous division of labor, indigenous checks and balances, a variety of actors that, by definition, in the sense of multiple cases of legitimacy, govern these disparate lands. So a lot of this happens to have survived in parts of the continent where there had historically been protectorates under the British imperial rule, which often meant that the number of settlers allowed into that territory were limited, which allowed the existing, the pre-colonial culture to survive. It has also allowed indigenous law and governance to continue. But let's highlight something that I mentioned a little earlier. None of these kings, none of these paramount chiefs were absolutists in the sense that is similar to, say, North Korea today. Yeah? They had to govern by consensus. They had to build a sense of social support for the policies they wanted. They had to act in ways that fell in line with the past precedents of law and governance. They had to fulfill the long histories of religion, ceremony, and culture. So all three of the kingdoms I want to talk about today were historically at strategic locations, at times where the trade routes would crisscross the continent. Southern Zambia now is a backwater, one of the poorest parts, not only of Zambia, but of Central Africa. Historically, this was an area that linked the various plains, the lakes, the rivers, that the west, the north, and the south of the continent. And
yeah,
the
we're
Lotse
having a bit of a problem with freezing up. We're freezing up every now and then, so I'm not sure what we can do about that. Just to be aware.
So once in a while, I'll stop and wait to see how things go, because I don't know when I freeze, I'm afraid. So
well, when you see my face again, you'll know that there's a problem.
Okay, right.
Anyway, I'm sure it'll be fine. It's just momentarily every now and then. Yeah. Okay, please continue.
So what we're having, therefore, in the late 19th century is not only British, French, Portuguese, but also from the north, Anglo-Turkish, Omani, incursions into the different parts of the continent. So here, we should also take into account that the regional kings and paramount chiefs were not powerless at the face of expanding colonialism. Now, most colonial powers, of course, had the industrial advancement on their side, but they were also geographically far too removed from their power bases, from ports, from the ability to project economic and military resources. So often there was more of a moment of trying to balance of powers against each other. So the stronger a kingdom, the likelier it is to survive strong into colonialism as a protectorate. And the stronger it is likely to survive as a strong player into the post-colonial era. But here we have one of the biggest, of course, moments when the future of the continent was formed, the late 50s, early 60s. Now, most of these traditional kingdoms, in the eyes of independence-minded intellectuals and revolutionaries, many of these kings, paramount chiefs, emirs, sultans, had been serving the colonial cause, and therefore they were discredited. They also represented some of the more traditional concerns about traditional law, traditional governance, and so on. Whereas the new nationalist leaders who were either emerging or were about to consolidate their power, from Julius Nyerere to Kwame Nkrumah, these were all products of the post-50s, 60s nationalist, socialist agendas that saw many of these traditional kingdoms as liabilities in the path of modernization and progress. So this also happened to be a time when ideas of modernization, progress, centralization, strong states, policies for reforms were very popular. So we have this centralizing impulse of the 1960s and 70s, vanguard party bringing in economic, political, legal advancement to their nations, came into clash with these traditional kingdoms. Many of these traditional kingdoms were also not necessarily bastions of enlightenment and modernism themselves. And it is here where I'm asking you to reflect on this in a sort of perhaps different way than we're used to, in the sense that we often try to justify various parts of a democratic order along their democratic credentials. Human rights activist groups, women's associations. So these are good actors doing good things. They have progressive values, and therefore they will serve the goals of liberal democracy. And I'm asking you to perhaps reflect on something a little different from this usual mindset. That is, if the goal is to ensure constitutions survive, if the goal is to ensure, without external aid and attention, that a country's legal, political, economic system can survive with I see it now, unstable internet connection. Okay, yeah. I hope you can hear me now. So what we have to also take into account is the fact that there might be yet unknown challenges ahead that we might not be ready to even reflect on. So what has to be done is, instead of the form of a political system, it is its function to survive on its own, to sustain itself, and to provide a sense of legitimacy to a people, or the peoples that constitute a country. So in this sense, even when they might have traditional conservative agendas, anything, or any collective entity, more precisely, any collective entity that might prevent absolutism, either the electoral variant of 50% plus one, or the religious variant, or the ideological variant, or the despotic charismatic leadership variant, anything that could prevent centralization, hold the center to account, and ensure pluralism, could be seen as servants of a liberal democratic order. And in that sense, the traditional kingdoms that will prevent a one citizen, one vote electioneering that will support the governing parties, anything that would bring legitimacy to smaller causes, towards collective entities with regional representation, anything that might put brakes on consolidating political centralization, therefore, should be seen as a homegrown version of checks and balances in the African context. In many ways, what we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq is that all those lofty ideals about a liberal democratic order cannot be installed by just writing the right laws and constitutions. A few idealistic foreign experts and a few bilingual or multilingual locals cannot
I think we're freezing again, Jan. Sorry, if we could just repeat that.
Sorry about this. So I know who's guilty, Vodacom, because they are providing.
Yeah, exactly.
But I wonder how much of the last few words
just the last sentence. Just the last sentence.
So essentially, the major argument that I'm trying to make here is that instead of looking at, say, the United States or France or Germany or Belgium or Canada, maybe certain lessons about what makes countries function is not necessarily going to be found in north-south comparisons, but perhaps south-south reflections at looking at places where traditional authorities have remained legitimate in the eyes of the locals, but while incorporating more modernist aspirations about individual rights and liberties. Anything that does not look as if it is imposed from the outside, anything that looks local and homegrown will also provide a sense of pride in one's own political system and create a sense of public ownership. So the point I want to highlight here is Ghana is perhaps Africa's one of the most successful democracies. Governments change with elections. Of course, things are not perfect, as it is the case everywhere. There are ups and downs, and there are tensions. Sometimes political conflict can become very tense. And yet, despite all the ingredients that would have created sort of a 50% plus one control of the judiciary, of the economic infrastructure, of the business, of the culture, and so on and so forth, there has been a remarkable sense of restraint from the political parties. Because in addition to political parties, the Asante, as well as the country's other traditional authorities, provide a sense of loyalty to many citizens, which then put brakes on political parties' abilities to command the very same loyalty. No matter how strong the rule of Museveni has become, the Buganda still are influential over city politics in Kampala, markets, anything from wearing masks to inoculation. Traditional authorities have provided important roles. So I think what we have to reflect on is, now that we have these entities with deep local roots, which enjoy widespread support by the locals, a sense of grassroots embrace, are there ways to trim their branches, maybe change the way we water them or we provide them with nutrients in a way that can be seen as homegrown versions of a basic law that could provide the future generations with a sense of rallying around the country's very own constitution, going back to the very etymological origin of the word. The formation, the makeup of a particular country is its constitution. That's where the origin of the word comes from. So in a modern sense, the idea that constitutions have become interchangeable based on best practices, adopting whatever works in Sri Lanka or Peru into a document might not always work. So there's a lot that I think we could learn from the past in order to better navigate the future. So I see that it's exactly past, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was really interesting. Can I just ask a follow-up question about the last item you mentioned? And that is, in my experience of South Africa, the governing party, whether it was the Old National Party or the ANC, always regarded the traditional leaders, and particularly the Zulu king, because there's so many Zulus, as controlling votes. And so they've always, fallen over themselves to do as much as possible for these monarchs and paramount chiefs. Most of the what were called paramount chiefs in the old days, bad old days, are now regarded as kings in their particular tribal areas. But the government has sort of fallen over itself in every case to give them resources and to pamper them and look after them because they control votes. would you, I don't know if this applies in Ghana, Zambia, and Uganda, the tribes you've mentioned up there, the kingdoms you've mentioned. You said that they perform a useful role in making people wear masks and, generally leading their communities. But there is the other aspect where they're sort of pampered by the government in power because they want they control votes, basically.
I think there are two very important parts to your question, Sheila, if I've understood well. One is, of course, how the powers of chiefs to deliver votes could create so much room for political manipulation, partisan politics. This happens, unfortunately, everywhere, not only in South Africa, from Nigeria to Ethiopia to Zambia. The idea that the tribal vote is the easy vote and they will follow whatever the head of the tribe says is something that we see throughout the continent. But I think the important element here is the degree of the power or the loyalty or the sense of belonging or attachment to the political party versus one's indigenous community.
Sure.
When the indigenous community is considered to be the primary sense of affiliation, belonging, loyalty, which is stronger than the other ones, say, as it is the case with the Ashanti, then political parties become perhaps tools of traditional politics, and they can play them against each other. I will deliver votes if you fix this, if you fix that, if this product grown in my region gets this price. So it is not a very simple linear relation where parties control indigenous authorities. It could act in very complex ways. And I think the other question that is important in this picture is that the fact that some of these kingdoms send migrant workers or do not always inhabit, as it is the case with some of the other kingdoms of Eastern Cape. Most of the young workforce look for jobs in Gauteng or elsewhere. So I think the ability to influence either politics or the liability to be influenced by politics depends on a number of additional factors. The economic power, the demographic power, the strategic location, the historical ties, the foreign friends one has. These all influence the degree of dynamics. But I think there is a little bit of a risk comes to do too much of political manipulation, because yes, there is not only its leaders, its traditions, its sense of identity. In the case of Zambia, for example, where all the chiefs are acting like members of the local branch party, then they lost the legitimacy in the eyes of the others, create a leadership contest. So it is very easy, but I think the idea of delivering votes happen in every democratic system. Why does one vote for Labour Party? Get their members to vote for a particular party. So the sense of collective identity, their leaders, is not only about traditional authorities, of course. But to sum up, what I wanted to say was there is a little risk of, if one uses too much of it, the entire system of legitimacy might be lost. The alternative is what the Asante Hene do, and that is taking a more cultural and ceremonial role so that one's legitimacy in the eyes of people from all walks of life is not questioned. And the other one is we also have to add another important element in the last bit to my answer, and that is to dislike a leader or the way a leader behaves does not necessarily mean one dislikes the very system. There are many of those who did not like President Trump, and yet the American Constitution and the federal system was also something they liked. So similarly, one could have a bad king, but a good traditional system.
Right. We have a question for you from one of the anonymous attendee, who asks, how much power should be devolved to local traditional leaders, especially regarding land tenure, law enforcement, and representation to central government bodies? Perhaps you could deal with that one. I see there are a couple of other questions coming in, so if you could deal with that one in the meantime. Yeah, and just be aware you are freezing a bit every now and then, so I don't know what one can do about that.
I really don't know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have this internet thing plugged on my laptop, so it's not like I could turn on and off a wireless to strengthen it. So this question that you just mentioned, how much control over land tenure, over local
and law enforcement.
Law enforcement. These
and
issues,
representation to government bodies. For example, in this country, there's a huge to-do about traditional courts and how much power they should have.
Again, this is a very complex question. The big question is very important, but it does not have an answer in the sense that, let me give you an example about tradition. Now, if you involve traditional leaders in traditional court, the question of how much remuneration should they receive, because historically it used to be based on tributes and gifts. So you are either going to open the system up to material encouragements, or you're going to force someone to an unpaid job in a faraway peripheral village who knows the laws, or you'll have to get those who know the law who might not know all the stories about the ancestors, the precedents, the local customary law. So the inclusion of traditional leaders might also undermine the very traditional authorities that are responsible for representing those laws. What also complicates things is that customary law within a tribe might also be crossed. So whose customary law is this going to be when, say, one is dealing with a divorce case, especially when there are differences between matrilineal and patrilineal versions of ownership, as it is the case in many African countries. It creates a lot of difficulties. What we have to remember here is the entirety of traditional law and governance, or indigenous law, or indigenous customary law itself is very diverse. There isn't one single form of traditional law. Some seek settlement, some seek retribution. Some are punitive, others seek to find ways to compensate the aggrieved party. So because there are many, many different variations, I think there's a long road ahead of us. One is to distill principles that could be put in national institutions that are the lowest common denominator of traditional legal systems. The same Americans talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or Canadians talk about peace, order, and good government. They could be variations of this. But also to recognize the fact that every local jurisdiction, regional jurisdiction, not only across tribes, but also within tribes, will have differences in the traditional law is applied. So therefore, I cannot give a cookie cutter, so a single standard model of an answer here. What is that sometimes some communities have traditionally been nomadic herders and they practice law in different parts of their territories, which complicates things even further because in places like Kenya, in Uganda, and in Nigeria, this brings herding and farming communities into conflict with one another. So to sum up, some recognition is important, but this is not a standard way of doing this. There are no easy answers, but at least a willingness to recognize that there are certain things that are working here for post-colonial, colonial, and pre-colonial times is a suggestion perhaps to study these more clearly and find more timeless elements of how these function. And a lot of it could be also a sense just pride in one's own past and own way of governing things. So sometimes symbolic recognition could do wonders. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. We have a question here from well-known journalist Peter Fabricius, who writes a lot about foreign affairs and African affairs. He asks, could you elaborate a bit on how you think kingdoms could positively influence the politics beyond them? Because he says you seem to be suggesting that they do. Yeah.
I think what I wanted to highlight here was two things. One is no society is governed by anarchy. Every society has its history, its past of governing itself. When these own laws and governance systems and doesn't like it when it is imposed on us. So anything that we could look back in centuries and millennia of existence and say, the way we do things reflects centuries of balancing different interests and concerns, then it makes it more likely that it will be obeyed. One of the interesting things about the Nigerian case that seems to confound a lot of outsiders is how what Peter Eke called publics out, but would have little problems about trying to find ways when the Western imposed laws during colonial and post-colonial era could be sidestepped. So that is the first part of the importance of traditional kingdoms. It gives a sense of public ownership, a sense of one's own history and land to the political system. So that's part one. Part two is the contemporary challenge we face in all the world. We saw this in the United States. We are seeing it in Russia. We are seeing it throughout the African continent. Philippines, Latin, there is now so much for 50% plus one type of election dictatorships or elected dictators or elected authoritarian rulers, where every structure of a state, its media, its legal service, business, its security, its police, its intelligence services fall prey to the single dominant party that has consolidated its rule. So a traditional kingdom, which has a long history connected to the land and people, its own rituals, its ceremonies, its aims for the political authorities, for the ministers, for the councils and the committees, could do a very important role in preventing a sort of a majoritarian centralization and make sure that the center is held to account. And this is not through principles of individual rights and liberties, but by the sheer sense of homegrown legitimacy of their existence. No political system in Ghana could ever survive if the Ashanti decide that it is an illegitimate system. So, and many voters or many Akan peoples who are loyal to the Asante Kingdom would also stop voting for their king if they see that he is co-opted into the political system. There's a fine balance. There is a potential to make the homegrown hold the center to account. So that was the second part of what I had in mind when I discussed the potential democratic role traditional kingdoms might have. And that is to act as an indigenous, homegrown version of checks and balances in preventing centralization.
Thank you. Just following on from that, there's another question from an anonymous attendee who says, given the complexities around decentralization in most African countries, will a more active role for traditional leaders not muddy the waters? Further, will it lead to a call for a similar role for religious leaders, for example?
That's a very good question, but it also, again, I'm sorry, this is not normally how I always answer questions, saying it's very complex, but once again, I have to highlight the fact that religion, politics, ceremony were often part of the same picture when it comes to traditional leadership. So the religious authority and the political authority and ceremonial authority were often cross-linked with one another. So yes, there is room for traditional religious authority to make voice for themselves as well. I think the big point that I am concerned about is between a perfectionism that disappoints and willingness to accept imperfect designs as they bring in a sense of stability. So this, at their core, is not a scientific opinion. It's not either or. It's a sort of a moral element of which cause, which concern is more important to you. A sort of blindly taking risks and trying to change the world by lifting every individual's rights up to the same level, perhaps not spending too much time thinking about how to enforce it and ensure that it survives, versus maybe taking it a little slower and thinking about first what is workable and what cannot be undone the moment the foreign friends leave, and then make sure that that is improved. I am more about the function rather than the form of a political system and a constitution. And the function should be to prevent absolutism.
Thank you. There's also another question from an interesting one from an anonymous attendee. Do initiation rites for young men and women help convey the tradition from one generation to another? How important are these?
Very important, but also yet one of those critical issues when it comes to colonial history, in the sense that the initiation rites that are commonly practiced here in South Africa is one, but across the continent there are variations of this, sometimes even stronger variations. In many parts of East Africa, particularly amongst the nomadic pastoralist communities, including Uganda's Karamojong, Kenya's Maasai, Ethiopia's Oromo, there are age groups. So kids from the same age grow up together in age groups, either 6, 7, 8-year cycles. So they do the initiation around the same time. They learn their local responsibilities around the same time. They remain like brothers, like sisters for a lifelong way. And usually in this complex age cohort system, they are also linked to younger generations. So in the Oromo, for example, there is a 40-year cycle. So those in their 40s to 48 years teach the newborn to 8 years about their indigenous culture. And this is also, again, one of those difficult questions, because some of those are secret practices, secret knowledge that should be passed on generation to another generation. And the very exposure to the broader public might undermine the very power of those traditions. So here again, knowing more about these will bring in more legitimacy, but knowing more about them will also undermine their ability to fulfill the design to fulfill centuries ago. Yes, they matter immensely. But let's highlight this once again. Not only are there very different traditional forms of governance and law on the continent, but even within the same tribes, different clans could have differences in their customary law. So when we think about the traditional, it is one size fits all. It is very different across geographies, across different parts of the continent, across their interaction with Abrahamic religions, the ones closer to Christianity, the ones closer to Islam, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Sorry. We have a question here from Paul Odiambo, who asks, what explains the success of elders in governance of Somaliland and the failure thereof, or of them, in the rest of Somalia? Could you distinguish?
This is a very interesting question, and for those not terribly familiar with the details, Somaliland is a self-declared, self-governing part of Somalia that, according to many indicate, seems to be providing a more stable and functioning rule of law in Somaliland. And a lot of this is done through clan elders. Now, elsewhere in Somalia, the same degree of stability does not exist, but I perhaps put the question to Paul as well, and sort of, if we reflect on the fact that here we have a complete state collapse, and yet elders clans still played
yes. We've had a bit of a freeze there.
Have not brought,
yeah, I wonder if you could just repeat that last bit.
Somaliland is generally recognized as a place where the elders provide an important role in providing day-to-day stability. But elsewhere in Somalia, the elders have still managed to fulfill an important role during state collapse. So things, state elders carried arbitration between different clans. Somali custody law was still practiced when there were disputes between clans. Yes, they have been fully successful, but maybe the alternative is to think it exists. Almost 30 years of civil war. So another important element is, of course, Somaliland elders have up because Somaliland also happens to have international friends who have invested heavily in Somaliland and its ability to function.
Right, thank you. We have another question here, somebody worrying about transparency. He asked, or she asks, because it's anonymous questioner, your thoughts on transparency and accountability of traditional leaders to their communities, because traditional governance tends to lean towards leaders being the be-all and end-all. So where do the communities gain transparency, especially when these leaders are corrupt, which alas happens quite often, according to the newspaper?
I try to highlight the fact that traditional.
We're really breaking up, Jan. I don't know what we can do about this.
I really don't know.
Well, we'll just start again, that one, because we missed it in the beginning.
Okay. Throughout the talk, I try to highlight the point that what we know as indigenous constitutionalism or traditional law and governance is not uniform structure. It is diverse, and historically it was more diverse. Accountability or transparency is a tricky question because it uses a Western notion of representation in order to bring in a non-Western sense of accountability. So I think the general notion of accountability is very important, but this perhaps the sort of using the more Western ideas about whether or not things are transparent or they should testify in committees might run the risk of hollowing out the very legitimacy of a traditional system. Essentially, in the many traditional court cases or deliberations I have witnessed or participated, I have observed how the judge or the chief or whomever elder is conducting the affair waits till the very last moment after days and days of long-winded talks and then seems to find a common settlement or a compromise. From case to case, it's always different. Usually the different parties to the conflict are known by the locals. Everyone knows details of what happens. Everyone has a good sense of tribe, what to their ancestors. When it tries to bring in these different elements in a sort of a lowest common denominator type of conclusion, satisfy the concern of everyone, makes it difficult to be transported to another setting in a way, here were the principles, here was the case, how I decided type of format. So in that sense, accountability is in many ways ingrained into indigenous system in the sense that variations of one saying I've seen across the continent, and that is, a chief is a chief in the sense that the people don't think the chief is good. Usually that chief does not remain the chief.
You're frozen again, Chris. Is that done? That's your answer. Hello?
I cannot do anything about the internet, I'm afraid.
No, sad. You've got this interrupted connection. Never mind. We have a question here from Chris Day, who's interested in your comments about encouraging traditional organizations to develop a more human rights focus. He gives the example of Eswatini, for example, and wants to know also what your thoughts are where there are disputes between traditional groups in the same country, for example.
Two important questions again. The first one, I think there is a path for us to reconcile concerns of individual rights and liberties, undifferentiated, standardized, applying equally to everyone, protecting every individual, be it outsiders, minorities, and so on, versus collective which benefit from recognition of a collective polity and entity. And I think a number of federal systems, particularly in my experience, the Canadian one, provide some sense of logic, because Canada also has indigenous polities, its indigenous tribes, but it also has a French-speaking province, a bilingual province, 8 Anglophone provinces, and territories. What we have, group rights are recognized and practiced within the jurisdiction that they are designed for, whereas individual rights apply across boundaries, across jurisdictions. So a similar logic, I think, in many ways could help provide in managing this tension between individual rights of every individual versus rights that collect languages, cultures, religions, ways of life, and so on and so forth. But of course, it's never going to be this easy, because demographics is going to play a role, economic power is going to play a role, regional concentration is going to play a role. The Khoisan, for example, because of the way they have been regionally dispersed in small bands, forager hunters, makes them very hard to claim a particular territory to ensure their traditional laws and governance structures are formally recognized. So this question about individual and group rights is very important, and it is probably gonna learn a lot about from places rights and freedoms are enshrined in constitutions. Now there was a second half to
disputes. Yeah, I think it was basically a question about how, you know, your thoughts on disputes between traditional groups in a single country.
Many of these.
There are some examples.
Okay, let me try again. Okay. Now, of course, what complicates things is what we define by the group. If it is a particular branch of, say, a tribe or a particular sub-tribe or a clan with a collective identity and a concern associated with a particular region, then it becomes that community versus the paramount king or the sultan or the emirate or whatever the particular authority is. Depending on the question, for example, in Ghana, what happens is that there is something called the House of Chiefs. Botswana has to, Zambia, a wee version, has it too. And it is usually the House of Chiefs then as the high traditional court in many ways that is left for trying to resolve this issue. Remember that many, not all, but many traditional systems of law seek settlements and compromise over creating winners and losers. So most Western legal systems, both the common law and the civil law system, tends to create winners and losers. Most traditional forms of arbitration, resolution involves elders, various different elements of leadership seeking a compromise. Internet unstable again. I wonder how much of that was heard.
I think most of it came across. Thank you.
Sorry, Sheila and Jan. Jan,
yes.
Maybe you can turn off your video and let's see if that helps them.
Okay, when you answer the next question, Jan, turn off the video and let's see what happens then, just as an experiment. We have a question from Joe Ansi van Veek, who asks, should the AU accommodate the traditional leaders? And if so, how? If not, why? Perhaps you have thoughts on that.
I think what is going to be difficult, but not impossible, is for an authority to decide who is the traditional leader, because the African Union itself cannot take the initiative. And for many countries, questions of who is part of which tribe and whether or not they are recognized is a political question, because as it is the case everywhere, governments like other political authorities that are close to them. So if national governments decide to pick who is going to represent which indigenous community, we will just have cases where the national government is supported by hand-picked members of a particular indigenous community. Yeah. There are a number of legal mechanisms about recognizing African culture, African identity, indigenous traditions, but I am more of a believer in the sense that instead of legal, official, constitutional, institutional recognition, let's think about how one could strengthen the practical, pragmatic function of these entities so that it doesn't end up becoming a legal question, but becomes more of a lived-in by citizens everywhere.
Right. Are you done? Do you want to
Yes.
reappear? Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
I don't know. We have time for another question, hopefully. We have here from an anonymous attendee, the colonialism of the 19th and 20th centuries come in for much criticism. You referred to that yourself. You've referred to the impact of the nationalist socialist leaders of the 20th century. Are these, the question asks, is this a necessary process of evolution, or is there possibly a new phase with better prospects ahead?
If I knew the answer, I'll be writing a book about it. But this is, I think, one of the questions that should be in the mind of all inhabitants of Africa and reflecting on changing global dynamics. Now, I think future historians are going to write about 2020, 2021 as sort of a critical juncture, a turning point in political history, where the mighty United States is retreating. The mighty Chinese don't know how to lead the world. They are going through moments of uncertainty about the future. Even in economics, we yet don't know what the path forward is. But one thing seems to emerge from all this discussion so far, and that is things are never confined to individual countries. Politics, economics, ideas have their own way of spilling over borders and capturing the imaginations and the plans of various political activists. Anyone who could find an explanation as to why things are so bad and a promise as to how better they could get will define the coming decades. Had communism not emerged 100 years ago, this might have been the perfect time for it to emerge, but that one is a dated ideology. So we're going to see if there's anything else that could come to replace the more technocratic, triumphant Western sense of liberal democracy and capitalism have won, and there are no alternatives left. Logic is going to come under fire. But yet no one seems to have come with an alternative. So it is not only going to be at the level of politics, but also at the level of ideas where we will see futures. Neither the Chinese, nor the Russians, nor the Indians, nor anyone else has the ability to sell a dream to the world at the moment. No one comes with the same logic of the 1960s and 70s during the Cold War. One side was saying, ours works. The other one was saying, ours is just. So now we are just realizing that we are going through yet another period of disillusionment. So every crisis, of course, is an opportunity. So I think we'll need the younger generation to create new ideas for the old planet.
Thank you, Jan. I've got time for one last question here from an anonymous attendee who says, you've made the case for incorporating traditional kingdoms into modern political systems as offering a stabilizing force in African society. But what are the actual mechanisms for doing so? Is there a playbook that current African countries can use? Can you give examples in which African states successfully combined an already existing modern political legitimacy with local traditional legitimacy? That's more or less what we've been talking about all evening.
Yeah. So let me sum up and say, the fact that something functions doesn't mean that it is perfect in the abstract. When you think about the world's oldest democracy, there is nothing neat, tidy, symmetrical about British democracy. Every document is convoluted. They are full of internal inconsistencies. They represent centuries and centuries of amalgamation of changes, evolution, revolution, gradual change. So what comes out is this document that is uneven in places, full of internal contradictions and so on and so forth. But it works. Similarly, when I say it works, this doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it provides a sense of a legitimate basic law around which the constituent communities and individuals come together. So when I say Botswana and Ghana as two successful examples of traditional authorities being brought into the fold of modern institutions, there are going to be many questions about, yeah, but this happened in Botswana, but that happened in Ghana. So yes, these are all true, but we also have to remember that despite all the ups and downs, these are two prosperous, self-sustaining countries that elect, deselect their leaders, change governments. Yes, so many things that are happening might not be ideal in these two countries, but the lesson there is too much emphasis on form, on designing things does not work. Let the practical course of things determine how multiplicity or diversity gets to be recognized in the system. So I'll sum up with this last thing. Function over form. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid time is up according to the invitation. We were meant to finish around 6:15. We're just past that time. And Jan, it's wonderful. Can I say you've given us lots of food for thought and some very interesting ideas, and you stimulated a lot of quite penetrating questions. I think people were thinking about what you said. Lovely to welcome you here in Cape Town, and so sorry it couldn't be live. But here would have been an opportunity for us to really get together again. You even wanted to have the background of Table Mountain on your
I did, yes.
Sadly, it didn't help with the lighting. But as I said, it's great to have you back. And we look forward to the next time. And thank you for a most stimulating hour and nearly an hour and a half. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you to the questioners. It was really interesting question. Thanks a lot.
Great questions, yes.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye from Sire.